It's the all-decisive final game of the Women's World Championship match between reigning world champion Wenjun and her challenger Tingjie. So far, 11 games, 9 draws, 1 victory for each player. And in game 12, we will get to see a decisive result. And then we have a new world champion. Or do we get to see a draw? Well, in that case, we are moving to the tiebreaks played on the next day. Wenjun is playing with the white pieces and she opens the game with the move 1d4. d5, knight f3, knight f6. And here, rare move at top level, it's the move e3, the collie system. It's a very modest move because your bishop from c1 cannot be developed to a more active square, to f4 or g5 for instance, because the pawn is on e3. But it's a very popular opening at club level, and the main idea is to avoid a theoretical battle, or at least try to get some sort of sideline. Wenjun is trying to surprise her very well prepared opponent, but we still get to see a very interesting game. As black goes for the most ambitious move, c5, trying to grab space by challenging the pawn on d4, d takes c5. Another surprise, as you do capture the pawn on c5, you're giving up your central pawn, and black is able to regain the pawn very soon. You can even play queen a5, queen takes c5, but then you don't really want to bring out your queen too early. e6, intending to take back with your bishop, is of course a better way of trying to complete your development. But now white has the opportunity to protect the pawn with the move b4. Black goes a5, challenging the pawn structure, and white plays the move c3. So that in case black is going to capture, you're able to take back with your c-pawn. That's what happened. a before, c before, b6. So that if this pawn is going to move or capture the pawn on b6, you're able to take with check on b4. And that will give black a very comfortable game. White gives a check on b5 with its bishop. Bishop d7. Bishop takes. And now knight takes. Once again, you cannot really advance the pawn because the pawn on b4 is hanging with check. White has a different idea. Played here the move a4. b takes c5. So black has won its pawn back. But now the pawn advances to b5. And this leads to a very interesting structure, which you can see in other openings as well. For instance, the Slav opening, the Notenboom variation. Maybe at some point we'll look at it as well. But here you do see that white has two connected passed pawns on a4 and b5. And the question is whether these pawns are really able to move forward, or does black have an advantage in the center? Look at black's pawns on c5 and d5. They can march forward as well together with the move e6, e5 at some point. So it's a very sharp final game. Exactly what we are looking for. And when you see this on the board, it's very hard to believe that we are getting to see a peaceful result. So black has different ways of playing. A very solid move would be bishop d6. There are sharp ideas to go g5 here, so that if you would take the pawn, you can go rook g8. This is very unnatural, but it's a computer suggestion. Very interesting stuff. In any case, queen c7 was played in the game. Looks also a useful move. Bishop b2. Bishop d6, so black places its pieces in such a way that at some point you can advance your e-pawn and try to take over in the center. White castles, and black does the same. Very logical way of playing. And now knight bd2. So both sides have completed their development, and it's a clash of ideas here. What should be played here? Difficult to say. Rook fc8 was played, so you bring your rook to the c file, so hoping to support the advance of the c-pawn very soon. But look what happens. White goes queen c2, and I think now very important moment for the rest of the game. As here, I believe that black should play the move e5. This is very typical way of playing, so that you have a nice pawn block. You're very flexible. And it's not really clear how white should be able to neutralize the march of these pawns. This was in fact played in one correspondence game, and I would like to show you one typical idea for these structures. Now, white's idea, of course, would be to play the move e4, so that if black advances the pawn to d4, you do get a fantastic blockade on the light squares. That is what white is aiming for. You can, for instance, put your knight on c4, and this knight can also support the advance of the other pawns. So that's not a really good idea. But what black should do instead is play here the move c4. So that if you do take on d5, there is the move c3 with a double attack. You're winning a piece, because now we see the point of having the rook on c8 and the queen on c7. They are supporting the pawn on c3. That is not possible for white. You cannot take the pawn. If you try to block the pawn with the move bishop c3, now the pawn can come forward to d4. And these pawns are unstoppable. Black has the initiative. So this is a very interesting position. There are different ways of playing for white. White should probably go rook fc1, control this square, and well, with correct play, it's a pretty balanced position. But let's compare to what happened in the game. As Lee played here the move c4 with the idea to advance the pawn to c3, but now you can play the move bishop c3 when you do stop the advance of the c pawn, and now the move e5 is definitely less impressive because white still has the pawn on e3, so you cannot really further advance your pawn to d4. This bishop is an excellent piece, not only stopping the pawn, the black pawns from marching any further, you do control this diagonal, and at the same time it supports the advance of the pawn of the a pawn. Knight c5 played, and white goes a5, so you see that white's pawns are rolling now. Black's idea is here the move knight b3. It was played by Lee. And the idea is that you cannot really take the knight, because after cb3, you're attacking the queen and the bishop is hanging. So after queen takes b3, it's queen takes c3 and black is just a piece up. Therefore, this knight looks quite strong. It's attacking the rook on a1. But if you play something like rook a2, everything is perfectly under control. It's not really clear what black is trying to accomplish here, because this pawn on a5 cannot really be taken because of rook f2 a1. You're doubling on the a file together with the bishop. You're attacking the knight on a5. If the knight goes away, then the rook on a8 is not sufficiently protected. So this looks as if white is winning material. Anyway, rook a2 is a very nice, classy move. Black is in trouble here. But Wenjun had a different idea. She thought, I can ruin the structure by taking on f6. Now, obviously, after g takes f6, there is knight takes b3, and after c takes, queen takes b3, white is a very big pawn up. This is not good news for black at all. So after bishop takes f6, there is knight takes a1, attacking the queen, but white, of course, had seen that the bishop from f6 is still covering that square, so you can recapture. Queen takes a5, queen to c3. With an attack on the queen, and of course you're threatening checkmate. How should you cope with that? Well, a move like bishop f8 would be a very nice move to stop the mating threat and say that you can take my queen, but then I get my rook on a5 and I do attack your pawn on b5 right away. That's a different way of playing, but instead the queens were swapped instantly. Queen takes c3, bishop takes c3, and now it's time to have a look at the position. The game has completely changed. And we see that white has only one pawn, but does have two knights. And black has a rook and two very nice pawns in the center. How to evaluate? I think black is absolutely fine. Rook cb8, attacking the pawn on b5. So white goes knight to d4. And the question is, what should black do now? Also, if you are trying to make a plan yourself, try to understand what the opponent is planning to do. And frankly speaking, I see that white's pieces, they are reasonably well placed. They are solid, but they're kind of stuck. They're not able to do much. This knight from d4 cannot really get in to c6 because that will hang the pawn on b5. So after a move like bishop c5 with ideas to take on d4, followed by taking on b5, is an idea white may consider rook b1 to overprotect this pawn. After rook a3, once again, I don't see a good way for white to make progress here. I think black is definitely okay, because once one of these pieces is going to move, White should also keep in the back of her mind that black's pawns, they can come forward. So not simple at all. But Lee, true to her style, want to play it very actively, and she played here the move e5, attacking the knight on d4, but allowing the knight to come into f5 with tempo. Now the bishop is under threat. If bishop moves, this pawn on e5 can be hanging. While after something like bishop c7, trying to keep the pawn defended, there is knight e7 check, and the pawn on d5 is hanging. That's not what you want to see happening. If black's center falls apart, then eventually the two minor pieces, they will excel. Instead, bishop f8 was played, but now bishop takes e5, attacking the rook. Bishop hits the rook. Rook takes on b5, and well, various ways of playing here. You got to watch out for potential tricks with two pieces standing on the 5th rank. But white played here the move g4. I like this move a lot. You're supporting the knight. There are never any back rank problems any longer. You may bring your king into the game. Black goes g6, kicks the knight out, knight to d4. And now black once again wanted to play it very actively with the move rook to b2. But okay, you're also standing on a square where it can potentially get under threat of the bishop. But look at this. This is a very nice, classy move by white. Where would you go with the knight? You can go to an active square like f3. But where does the knight belong? On the blockading square c3. Together with the knight and the bishop, black's pawns have been brought to halt. And this looks excellent for white. Bishop g7 played. Bishops were exchanged now. And now the knight comes into c3. And you can see that the pawn on d5 is under threat. And this rook cannot really go to b2. From b2 to b3 or to c2 to attack the knight, because this knight on d4 covers very important squares as well. So I think white's blockade is quite stable. Rook a5, protecting the pawn. Rook d1, announcing the plans to move the knight away. After rook b6, the knight dropped back to e2. So you're attacking the pawn on d5 one more time. Rook b3 was played. This is a tricky move because don't get too greedy now. You can take the pawn on d5, and after trading off one pair of rooks, there is still a bit of counterplay. Things are not that simple, but this pawn on d5, it's not a dangerous pawn. It's not running away. If you would take with the knight on d5, even rook d3 is a nice way to prove that white's pieces are a bit discoordinated, and the pawn can become very strong. So it's better for white to keep rooks on the board. So what should you do instead? Well, the move played by Wenjun is very instructive, as she played here the move king to g2. No rush at all, just bringing the king into the game. What can black do? Not much at all. h6 was played, king f3, the king comes to a better square, f6, rook c1, protecting the knight. And the idea is that the other knight, would love to come to f4 to attack the pawn on d5. And then you see that it's an even better version for white to win the pawn on d5, because the rooks are staying on the board, and very soon the pawn on c4 can be collected as well. If you try to prevent the knight from coming in to f4, then it's knight d4, and well, you can go knight f5 next with check, and that's also a beautiful square for the knight to go to, with problems to keep your pawn defended. If you go king g6, knight e7, another fork is in the air. So black just waited patiently with king f7, but now the knight comes to f4, and this pawn will be taken on the next move. No matter what, black didn't want to allow that. Played here the move d4, looking for counterplay. After e takes d4, the third rank is open. If you go rook a3, with an attack on the knight, there is a knight fe2 still. So that's not a problem. Everything is well protected still. Black played g5. You got to go back to e2, because if you would go to d5 to protect the knight, it's rook takes d5, and the knight is not a good defender. It's pinned. So knight fe2, and white is in the driver's seat here. You can bring your king, advance the pawn, centralize the king even further, win another pawn, and step by step you see that the extra piece, the extra knight, is really worth something. And technically speaking, black's position is lost now. Black is looking for counterplay. How should black try to fight here? Aim for the exchange of pawns, because the more pawns are getting exchanged, the closer you get to a draw. Imagine all these pawns come off the board and you have a possibility as black to trade off rooks as well. White is not able to give checkmate with 2 knights only. That's something you should keep in the back of your mind. f5 played, gf5, rook takes f5, king e3, the king centralizes, g4, trying to fix the pawn on f2, but allowing the knight to come in to f4, rook b8. What else? The rook was not doing much there on b3. d5, rook f6, white is making progress, rook c2, another classy move, just to cover the second rank, so you're protecting your remaining 2 pawns on f2 and h2. In case of something like rook e8, you can just block with your knight, and step by step the knights are taking over in the center. So black instead played here rook a8, and now knight to b5. We are ready. Take the pawn on c4. Rook b6, attacking the knight. Knight goes to d4, rook a3 check, king e4, c3, and now it's knight fe2. We're going after this pawn. Rook b2, here again. Don't take the pawn too quickly. If you would take on c3, the rook's coming off the board, and there is rook takes f2, and black has counterplay. Don't allow that. The same for knight takes c3. This is a serious mistake, as it does allow rook takes c2, knight c2, and your knight on c3 is still hanging. So, once again, what should white do? Not rush at all. Just get your king back to keep everything well covered, suppressing the counterplay. Rook b1, and now you take on c3. Very annoying pawn. So eventually white's strategy of wrapping up these pawns has paid off. Rook h1, going after this pawn on h2. But white goes f3 as the rook covers the pawn on h2. After gf3, the knight recaptures, and here again, the 2 knights and the pawn, it should be a technical win. Of course, you gotta watch out for potential checks or skewers, but white's pieces are very close to each other, so technically it should not be too problematic to convert. Rook f1, knight e4, king e7, king c4, rook f4, pinning the knight. I'm not sure why white didn't play here the move king c5. Seems very logical to me. Rook b2 was played. And after rook h4, rook b7, king f6. Now Wenjun thought, wait a second, I gave a check, but it's not really clear what I'm accomplishing. My pawn on h2 is hanging, so I should go back. And probably that's a sign that also she was suffering a bit from her nerves in the final game of the World Championship match. She decided to play it safe, admit her mistake. There's nothing wrong to go back with the rook to b2. If black would go back with the king to e7, this may lead to a repetition of moves. But of course, now, if this would have happened, white would have found a way to keep the game going. And for instance, knight b5 with the idea to go king c5, march together with your king and knights forward to support the advance of the d pawn. Anyway, black didn't go for king e7, played rook back to a8, king c5 with the idea that if you give a check now, the knight from d4 is no longer pinned. There's no king on c4, so you can interfere on c6. Instead, rook h3 was played, attacking the knight, knight cb5, rook e3. There's not much black can do. d6, king e5, and now the knight comes in to c6 with check, with a point. If you go back to e6 to stay in touch with this pawn, it would allow the move knight c7 with a deadly knight fork. White wins the game. Of course, that was not played. King e4 on the board. And now after the move d7, white is about to queen her d-pawn. And that would be just game over. If you have 2 extra knights, probably there are even other ways of playing. After the move rook d3, knight d6 check was played, interfering on the d-file so that the rook is not able to take this pawn. Now after the move king f4, probably black was hoping that there would follow a move like d8, so you take with the rook, and okay, with 2 extra knights there may be drawing chances. I don't believe in it, but a much simpler technique is not to queen your d-pawn too fast, but play instead the the alternative rook b8. Now both rooks are no longer controlling the promotion square, which means that after maybe 1 or 2 more checks, the d-pawn is about to queen, and then it's just absolutely game over. Here, with this final move of the match, Wenjun secured that she retained her Women's World Championship title. And that is very impressive. Very tense match, 6.5, 5.5, winning $300,000. Okay, Lee Tingjie goes home with $200,000. Not bad at all, of course. Kudos to the fantastic games played by these two very strong female players. And definitely Lee Tingjie will get another shot to try to win the World Championship title at some point. But for now, Wenjun is still the current champion. And congratulations to her. Congratulations to you for watching this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. And very soon we'll cover much more top games. And of course also from the best women players in the world. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye bye.